And right now on Andrea Mitchell Reports, king for a day. South Carolina's most powerful Democrat in the state crowns Joe Biden as the former vice president tries to halt Bernie Sanders' winning streak.
I know his heart. I know who he is. I know what he is.
If you send me out of South Carolina with a victory, there will be no stopping us.
Southern brawl. Bernie Sanders getting the front-runner treatment, and with it, an onslaught from the rest of the field.
Imagine spending the better part of 2020 with Bernie Sanders versus Donald Trump.
I will tell you, Pete, what the American people want, and Joe, what the American people want. They don't want candidates to be running to billionaires for huge amounts of funding.
Bernie, in fact, hasn't passed much of anything.
I do not think that this is the best person to lead the ticket.
Bernie will lose to Donald Trump.
And not if, but when federal health officials prepare to brief the president today on the spread of the coronavirus, sounding the alarm even as the White House tries to downplay the risk.
We fully expect we will see more cases here in the United States. We have to be mentally prepared and also, as a government, prepared.
You may ask about the coronavirus, which is very well under control in our country. We have very few people with it.
And good day, everyone. I'm Andrea Mitchell in Washington. Joe Biden trying to fight his way back after weak showings in those first early states, rebounding now with a strong debate performance in South Carolina and rewarded with the important endorsement of Carolina kingmaker Jim Clyburn before Saturday's primary. But Biden is still well behind frontrunner Bernie Sanders in delegates and money. Sanders has also been campaigning in Super Tuesday states that vote next week, while the former vice president remains locked down in South Carolina to prevent another loss. Sanders, despite his popular strength, defending whether a Democratic socialist can defeat Donald Trump.
If you look at battleground states like Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, polling just
The polls aren't the election.
I beat Trump. And if you want to beat Trump, what you're going to need is an unprecedented grassroots movement of black and white and Latino, Native American and Asian people who are standing up and fighting for justice.
Can anybody
That's what our movement is
in this
about.
room imagine moderate Republicans going over and voting for him? And
Absolutely.
you have to do that or you can't win.
It was a mess. Joining me now, NBC's Mike Memoli covering the Biden campaign. Yamiche Alcindor, White House correspondent for PBS NewsHour, back from South Carolina. Jim Messina, manager for President Obama's 2012 re-election campaign, and former Republican National Committee Chairman Michael Steele. Well, Mike Memoli, have they caught a breath yet? It was quite the debate. Joe Biden with a strong performance that he needed, but all of the other externals really running against him, not just for South Carolina if he pulls it out there, but looking at Super Tuesday, we can talk about what he has to accomplish, given that the other candidates have been spreading across the country, and he's been really stuck in South Carolina, holding that firewall up.
Well, the strategy, Andrea, at this point for Joe Biden is that a strong finish here will send him into Super Tuesday with a lot of momentum. And certainly they're hoping that today's endorsement from Jim Clyburn, along with that debate performance last night, will launch him to a big victory here in South Carolina. You saw Clyburn himself, a towering figure, of course, here in South Carolina, the highest ranking African-American in all of government, really, as the House Majority Whip right now. He said himself that he always knew who he was voting for. It was just a matter of whether he would make that endorsement publicly known. But as in his endorsement, it was a very heartfelt one, talking about the long friendship he's had with Biden, how much his late wife, who just died last September, loved Joe Biden. He also said he's never been more fearful for this country, and that it's not about making America great again. He said America is already great. It's about who can help make America's greatness accessible to the most people. He said that's Joe Biden. Now, Joe Biden, for his part, giving a little bit of a trial run for some new language we may be hearing from him, especially as he looks to narrow the focus of Democratic voters to him against Bernie Sanders. He said there are some out there talking about a revolution, but most people just want results. They want somebody who can help them maintain dignity. But he also talked about how important South Carolina is for his strategy going forward. Let's take a listen.
South Carolina chooses presidents. You decided to launch Bill Clinton to the White House. And up to that time, it didn't look like he was going very far. You launched my buddy Barack Obama to the White House. And I firmly believe, once again on Saturday, you hold in your hands, in South Carolina, the power to choose the next president of the United States. And I'm here, heart and soul, with everything I've got, to earn the support of the people of South Carolina.
One other positive signal for the Biden campaign here that they're touting today, talking about last night's debate performance, they say they've had their biggest online fundraising day since the beginning of the campaign. He desperately needs that money, of course, to go on the air for Super Tuesday. Andrea.
Yeah, money's going to be a major factor. He hasn't been on the air. Yamiche, first let's talk about the African-American voters in South Carolina, what you were picking up during your reporting days down there, leading up to and after the debate.
Well, first, African-American voters in South Carolina stress to me that they want people to understand that they're not a monolith, that you can't just come down if you're a candidate and talk about criminal justice and expect to have people back you. But the people that I have been talking to say, apart from criminal justice, there's also, of course, education, there's wages, there's health care. There are all these different things that are on the mind of voters. But I should say it's clear that Joe Biden is losing ground there, and the polls are not wrong when they say that his lead has narrowed substantially. I talked to one 64-year-old veteran. He said, I really wanted Joe Biden to run in 2016, but now I'm just not so sure that he has the fight left in him to do it. He seems as though he's not someone who is willing to really get in the mud with Donald Trump, and that person was pretty worried about the fact that Bernie Sanders was also going to be possibly the nominee. There are a lot of people who are older African Americans, who are establishment Democrats, who are really worried about the title of socialist. They don't understand the nuances between a democratic socialist and Cuba's communism, and that's something that, of course, we saw Bernie Sanders get hit with. But African American voters are very, very eager to have their say in South Carolina, and Bernie Sanders has made a pretty good effort of trying to get young African-American voters to go for him, and those numbers are going up. I talked to another young African-American woman who told me our lives need radical change, and Bernie Sanders is offering that.
Sanders has been ahead, Jim Messina. Bernie Sanders really took a lot of incoming on the stage last night, but he has some big advantages going forward. Look at that rally he had the other night in Texas, Saturday night in Texas. He's been in California a lot. He's been in Virginia. I think tonight he's going to North Carolina. He's been able to cut loose and go to other states. He doesn't need South Carolina as a victory as much as obviously Joe Biden does.
No, you're exactly right. Joe Biden absolutely simply has to win on Saturday to continue in this race. And Bernie has something else going to his advantage, which is money. You know, he and Michael Bloomberg are the only people on the air in some of these Super Tuesday states that are really going to decide. You know, 40% of voters and delegates are going to be given here on Super Tuesday. And as you know, Andrea, half of the voters on Super Tuesday are going to vote early. So that's why last night's debate was so important for Joe Biden. But every single day, people are voting. And right now, in some of these Super Tuesday states, they're just seeing ads from Mayor Bloomberg and from Bernie Sanders.
And speaking of Mayor Bloomberg, he was trying to make the point that he is the person who helped secure the House by, contributing to 40 of those freshman Democrats who turned red states. But let's show what happened. There was, let's just call it a Freudian slip last night, which a lot of people picked up on.
They talked about 40 Democrats. 21 of those were people that I spent $100 million to help elect. All of the new Democrats that came in and put Nancy Pelosi in charge and gave the Congress the ability to control this president, I got them.
I got them. Michael Steele, if you're the billionaire on the stage being attacked by Sanders and certainly Elizabeth Warren, my gosh, we'll talk about that in a moment, and a lot of the others as being the billionaire, not so cool to say you bought those seats.
No, it's not at all. That's a tricky moment. He caught himself. People still got it. But people know what the game is, and everybody knows a guy who's already spent $500 million on his race, who did spend $100 million on the 2018 cycle. Yeah, he's buying stuff. We get it. The question for the Democrats, and Bernie Sanders has already made it very clear, I don't want your money if I'm the nominee. Well, I can just tell you, Bernie, that's kind of dumb, because if a guy wants to spend up to $1 billion to help you get elected, you take the money. And that's the problem that doesn't translate for a lot of Democrats around the country. It's like, we need everything on the table to defeat Donald Trump. This is not going to be an easy race, even with the best candidate at the top of the ticket. So I think what you see with Bloomberg is basically doing a two-step. One, I want to be the nominee. I will be the nominee because I'm willing to do all these things. But if I'm not, I'm also going to help the party. The resistance to that from the Bernie folks, I think, can be more of a turnoff than they realize, because voters are like, well, you're gonna lose then if you don't want to take the resources from someone like Michael Bloomberg. Why would we make that investment? Because we can't generate that kind of money. You have not been able to generate that kind of money in the campaign so far. So it creates a little dicey moment for Sanders as much as it does for Michael Bloomberg.
Now, Michael Bloomberg did so much better last night than the week before. Could not have been worse. Let's posit that. He did a lot better. Yeah. Was it a mistake for him to try to say, look, I can, in a general election, I can win moderate Republicans? In a Democratic primary debate where you've got these Warren and Sanders and others who don't even want to hear about moderate Republicans.
Well, they don't want to hear about it, but he's speaking truth, because it's the only way you're going to defeat Donald Trump. You've got to pull Republicans off of Donald Trump. You've got to go for that center-right as much as you go for that center-left.
And Jim Messina, looking forward, how do you see this shaping up as you go into Super Tuesday? Biden doesn't have the money. Sanders has money and populism and enthusiasm in a lot of these states. Is it boiling down, though, with, let's say that nobody gets out, that everybody has enough online money to keep going or limping forward into Super Tuesday? Does it become totally Bernie, or who's the second person, if there's a second or a third person in the race?
Well, that's the question, right? There's got to get some candidates out of this race in the next few days, probably right after Super Tuesday. This race has got to kind of come down to Bernie Sanders and one other alternative. And I think that's what Super Tuesday is going to do for the party. They're going to start to weed out some of these candidates who've had really good runs, but just can't, afford to stay in this race. Money is the oxygen of American politics, as Michael points out. And some of these candidates just aren't going to be able to sustain it. It's why Biden needs a victory this weekend to sustain it and raise the money. It's why, Bernie's on TV right now, because he has that oxygen. And it's why Bloomberg is starting to move. 70% of voters, Andrea, say the most important issue in this primary is who can beat Donald Trump. And that's what voters are trying to figure out.
But, Jim, very briefly, if Mike Bloomberg can't show a better ability on the debate stage or in retail politics to handle, his downsides, is he one of those players going forward after Super Tuesday?
Look, I'd rather have $500 million of TV ads than one good debate. And that's his appeal, right? And every night on TV, I'm sitting in California, and all you see is Michael Bloomberg ads on TV.
That's an answer to that question, indeed. Jim Messina, I'd rather have $500 million than a good debate. I'll take that. Mike Memoli, Yamiche Alcindor, Jim Messina, Michael Steele, thank you all so much. President Trump will speak to reporters tonight at 6 o'clock Eastern. I'm not sure we know the format yet, whether it's a full-blown news conference or just a couple of questions, but he's going to be discussing the coronavirus one day after he tried to reassure the markets and the public about the disease, and that backfired.
You may ask about the coronavirus, which is very well under control in our country. The people are getting better. They're all getting better.
We have contained this. We have contained this. I won't say airtight, but pretty close to airtight. We've done a good job in the United States. Hats off to our public health people.
Well, the markets didn't like that at all. The president and his chief economic advisor trying to project a rosy scenario. At the same time, the professionals, the health experts, the scientists at the CDC were saying that it was not a question of if the epidemic gets to the U.S., but when, and that Americans should be prepared for disruption in their daily lives. More than 81,000 cases, 2,700 deaths so far worldwide. At the time we got on the air, it may more being reported every day. NBC's chief foreign correspondent, Richard Richard Engel is in Singapore, where nearly 100 cases have been reported, but more than half of those patients have recovered. Phil Rucker is the White House bureau chief for the Washington Post. He is co-author of the book, A Very Stable Genius. Also with us, Dr. Zeke Emanuel, special advisor to the director, the general of the World Health Organization, and a former senior advisor to the Obama White House on health policy, now chairing medical ethics and health policy at the University of Pennsylvania. Welcome all. Richard, first to you there. Ground zero, really. Singapore, of course, and China and the other Asian countries where it all started. Now in Singapore, what are you hearing? How is it spreading?
So we came here because there is a lab where they're working very closely to try and isolate this virus, to figure out its weaknesses. I went to a lab earlier today and spoke with one of the top virologists in the world, and that in this laboratory they are keeping the most pure strain of the coronavirus, and they have they have it, and they are trying to break down its genetic code to see what works to kill it. And they have some promising leads, but nothing yet. And the virologist told me that it is, in her opinion, going to become a pandemic. You cannot bluff your way through this. You can't market your way through this. You can't just tell people everything is going to be all right when the people who are working very directly with this virus say that it is a matter of time before it spreads. What she told me, what was most unique about this virus, and she's worked on viruses for the past 20 years in frontline experiences, is that it is so contagious. It is not the end of days virus. It is not going to kill us all. 98% of people get better. 98% of them often have mild symptoms, but that is still 2% roughly that die when they get this, and generally it is the elderly or people who are infirm because they have pre-existing medical conditions. And that, if you spread it out over the entire possible infected population, could be a very large number of casualties. She thinks this is going to become a pandemic. We also talked about where it came from, and that is important. That is important in this information age, because if you look online, there are a lot of rumors. Especially now, there are a lot of people going to Google trying to figure out where this came from. And one of the big conspiracy theories out there was that this was some secretive Chinese weapon or a biological weapon that was put out there or escaped. She actually worked in the facility in Wuhan that is often pointed to as a potential culprit for a place where this virus was allegedly being made. She says that is absolutely not the case. She is very convinced, about 90% sure, that it came from bats, and that it was from bat to human in a illegal wildlife market in Wuhan, China. So let's just hear a little bit of what she had to say. We actually went into a cage and saw some of the bats that they are working on and conducting research to try and figure out how the transmission happened and what can be done to find the vulnerabilities in this coronavirus.
So you don't think this was some biological weapon, some plot?
I do not. I don't think it was either intentional or accidental release. This virus came from the wildlife.
Came from bats?
Most likely came from bats, yes.
And came from bats in this wildlife market?
Yes.
That was pretty extraordinary. With your reporting now, Dr. Emanuel, what have we learned about the mortality? The mortality rate that I had heard from the World Health Organization was generally about 2.5% to 3%. This is not Ebola. But the transmission is also different. Why don't you with your expertise, tell us, having experienced
Andrea,
the other kind of disease?
You're 100% correct. This isn't at the extreme, either SARS, where we had about a 10% mortality, or Ebola, where you have a much higher mortality, can be as high as 50, 60%. This is closer to seasonal flu. Given the world statistics now, it's somewhere between 2.5% and 3%. But remember, those world statistics of 81,000 cases probably ignore many more cases that are so mild, people think they have a cold or a cough, but don't think that they have coronavirus. So even if you say dilute that number by 5-fold or 10-fold, you're down to about 0.5% mortality rate, which is higher than seasonal flu, which is usually around 0.1%. That's 1 out of every 1,000 people who get it will die from it. So it's very different. On the other hand, it's very transmissible, and that's what we're seeing when we've got these hotspots popping up in Iran, in Italy, and in other places where no one has been to China, but now you're getting transmission person to person, and that seems to be very easy. One person transmits it to about 2.5 to 3 people, and then they transmit it. And that's actually the serious problem is, as your correspondent mentioned, widespread transmission with a low death rate is still a high number. And I do think we all in America need to be well aware. We still have a very low number of cases. There are no cases, for example, I'm in Philadelphia, no cases in Pennsylvania. This is going to get worse before it gets better. And I think we need to be prepared for that. And it's been quite clear that the White House has been very slow in preparing or even recognizing this as a problem. I somehow think that maybe they thought closing the border to people from China would do it. At best, it's delayed the entry into the United States. It's certainly not going to prevent it.
And on that exact point, Phil Rucker, you've done so much reporting for your book, Very Stable Genius, on the president's responses. What we saw here was the president in India trying to reassure the markets, because he measures things by the stock market, as well as, you know, Larry Kudlow, his economic advisor. And it backfired because the CDC was telling a more accurate forecast. Plus, they've cut the CDC budget. Secretary Azar is on the Hill today getting slammed over that. The budget proposal's been cut. Chuck Schumer says we need another $8 billion, not the $2.5 that have been proposed. These are proposed budget cuts. But science has been so downgraded in this administration that the markets can't really believe what they're hearing.
That's right, Andrea, and that's one of the challenges for this president right now. If, in fact, the coronavirus does expand and become a global pandemic, as many of the experts fear is only a matter of time. You have a president here who's been at war with science inside the government, at war with facts, who regularly exaggerates, manipulates the data and the truth in his public presentations. And this is a moment when precision is warranted and needed and necessary. The American people and the world really are going to be looking to the president to hear truthful accounts of what's happening, what they should do, what they should be fearful of. And if everything's okay, then they should hear that too. But it's a president who's not really equipped for this moment, given his track record and the way he has been so loose with facts and information, and the way he has discredited the scientists within the government, sought to diminish their power, sought to cut their budgets, and cast them out.
Phil Rucker, Richard Engel in Singapore, Dr. Zeke Emanuel in Philadelphia, thanks to all of you. Senator Elizabeth Warren was relentless in attacking former Mayor Mike Bloomberg last night. Got to be personal, in fact. In one exchange, Warren once again ripped into Bloomberg over non-disclosure agreements signed by women who worked for his company, despite the changes he made since the last debate.
If he says there is nothing to hide here, then sign a blanket release and let those women speak out.
What the senator did suggest was that we release these women from the non-disclosure agreement. I did that 2 days later, and my company has said we will not use non-disclosure agreements ever again. The senator has got it, and I don't know what else she wants us to do.
Oh, I'll be
We're
clear.
Following exactly what she asked to do.
Tell you exactly
And the
what I want
trouble
you to
is,
do.
with this senator, enough is never enough.
Joining me now from South Carolina, Josh Letterman, NBC News national political reporter, following the Bloomberg campaign, and Ali Vitale, NBC News political reporter at the Warren campaign event in Orangeburg, South Carolina. Ali, first to you. A lot of people today questioning Warren's strategy here. She's going into Super Tuesday. She's not trying to slow down Bernie Sanders. There was one pretty frontal attack on Sanders, but for the most part, she continued to hammer Mike Bloomberg, who's not going to drop out. He's got the money to keep going through Super Tuesday. So with her not having won any of these big states so far. Why keep going after Bloomberg and not after the frontrunner?
And that's a question that I asked her after the last debate and then again last night. She feels comfortable in this strategy because for the Warren campaign, they think there's no better foil for Elizabeth Warren than Michael Bloomberg. Obviously, there's no love lost between them. You saw how easy it was for her to go after him. On the Bernie Sanders front, that's a lot more complicated of a situation. Of course, there's the personal factor between the two of them, that they call each other friends. But then there's also the policy underpinnings of both of their campaigns. We saw Elizabeth Warren last night do something that I've never seen her do before on the campaign, which is make an explicit contrast between herself and Bernie Sanders, saying that she thinks that she will be the better president because of an argument that she's been making about how efficient she'll be in enacting the progressive agenda that they share. You'll notice, though, that Bernie Sanders also didn't really come back at her with anything in that moment, showing that it's a complicated relationship for both of them, because if they're going to go after each other, they have to do it in a very specific way. No broadsides, because their policy is very similar. They have to go at each other for a very specific thing. For Elizabeth Warren, that thing's efficiency.
Well, you are very precise, very careful, very insightful in your analysis there, because they call each other friends. I think they've been political rivals in a lot of ways for the same constituency. And going forward, it makes sense, as you described it. But, you know, Josh Letterman, it just seems that Bloomberg, he was prepared for it, but in some ways not. It's hard to withstand the kind of barrage that was coming at him.
It is, and it's difficult if you're in that position to defend yourself when you're saying, I never said these comments, and Bloomberg has actually said under oath in a lawsuit that he didn't make those comments. Elizabeth Warren says that he did, and so how do you push back against that? Elizabeth Warren was not in the room for those comments, neither was I. Mike Bloomberg was, and this woman was, who does say that he said that. But the Bloomberg campaign feels like he did make some improvements in last night over the way he'd answered this before, in that he was not dismissive as much as he was in the first debate, where he basically brushed this off as some inappropriate jokes he'd made. Last night, he said, look, people were bothered by this. If they were bothered, then I'm sorry. And they felt that was a better image for him to project.
And just to give you an idea of how prepared he is to go the long distance, at least through Super Tuesday, if that's the long distance, they've put out a note that they're going to produce a new ad airing tomorrow on coronavirus and on the lack of preparation of this White House and how he would be best prepared to handle a crisis like that, which plays to the management experience. Not such a great debate talking point, but it might be more effective in an ad. Josh Letterman, Ali Vitale, thanks for calling in, for joining us from the field. The Taliban and the Afghan government now are expected to sign an agreement Saturday that could pave the way for a phased withdrawal of U.S. troops from Afghanistan and the beginning of the end to America's longest war. But there are no guarantees in this deal for the Afghan women. Former Chief of Staff to First Lady Laura Bush, Anita McBride, telling NBC News that the treatment of women by the Taliban in Afghanistan was one of the central tenets of engagement by the U.S. and the coalition countries in Afghanistan. In 2008, Laura Bush spoke about meeting Afghan women after her trip to Kabul.
I've met Afghan women who are heroes of their generation. Some risked their lives to teach in underground schools. Others left their families and homes behind to pursue an education outside of their country. Because of their courage and determination, their children will inherit the fortune of freedom and the fundamental right to be educated regardless of gender.
But will they? Joining me now is retired four-star Marine Corps General John Allen, who is the commander of international forces in Afghanistan, the NATO forces, and is now at the Brookings Institution. And Anita McBride, former Chief of Staff to First Lady Laura Bush, who was traveling with her and was one of the architects of that program. Thank you both so much. Let me start with you, Anita McBride, because you saw on the ground what it was like, and I saw it. I was on some of the trips with secretaries of state during that period, with Condi Rice, with later, you know, Hillary Clinton, John Kerry. The co-education at the American University in Kabul, for instance, which has been a target of Taliban fire in recent years. It meant so much when I met with those young women, and some of them told me that they had been disavowed, disinherited by their families and their villages for even going to schools with boys.
Right, and for participating in all sectors of their society. Yet they are amongst the most resilient and determined women you'll meet anywhere in the world because of what the prices that they have had to pay to get to that point, to be educated, to be able to move about freely in society. They don't want to go back. And this is one of the things they're scared about now, and rightfully so. We know what the record is of the Taliban and its treatment towards women. We know what the record is of women that have beaten all odds to be function in this society. And who do you want to believe at this point?
And John Allen, you saw on the ground the cost, the horrific cost of this war. No question that we have to draw down, get out at some point. We can't create a democracy, a Jeffersonian democracy in Afghanistan. But first of all, can we trust the Afghan government, which is still fighting over who won the election? It's a coalition, so-called unity government, as negotiators. Do you trust the Taliban, who've still been attacking until recently? What about the Haqqani network and outsiders trying to disrupt any peace?
That's a complex question, and it's a complex answer. First, let me just say I'm honored to share this interview with Anita, whose work on empowering women is legendary, and we're all deeply grateful for all that she's done in this regard.
Indeed.
Look, we have to trust the Afghan government. Ashraf Ghani is a friend of the United States, and we have to see them as a partner. We have to see them as the solution to this problem. And there seems to be some ambivalence in some of the leadership of the U.S. about where this government in Kabul.
Anita, while we straighten that feed out from the Brookings Institution, and I apologize to General Allen because we want to get him back as quickly as we can. When the retired general talks about ambivalence, I certainly picked that up from Mike Pompeo yesterday. They're not saying that this is a red line, that they're going to do anything affirmatively to protect the status of women.
Well, I think also, too, it is a function of how Americans are weary. And I think the leadership in our government is reflecting that. This is a long, protracted war. We understand that. We've paid a heavy price. Americans have. Our military have. And we're at a place where we would have hoped by this point that the Afghans would have been able to do this all themselves. But because of these currents of terrorism, these currents of the regime of the Taliban that are still fundamentally functioning in Afghanistan and growing in their control, it's making it very hard.
Now, one of the things that's going to happen in Doha is Zal Khalilzad, who has been the special envoy, and possibly others coming from the State Department are going to be observing the signatories, but we, the Americans, are not signatories. And so this is really between a fairly weak Afghan central government and the Taliban. And we don't know what they're putting in this draft agreement.
Well, that's right. And I think those are the things that we worry about more. What's not in the draft. We know Taliban doesn't have a great record of being willing to have intra-government, intra-Afghan conversations. And that is going to make it very difficult to believe that there's going to be a result that's lasting and binding. And they see us as the enemy,
which is
another process.
Let me ask John Allen. We just straightened out our connection to Brookings. John Allen, you were in the middle of saying that it's complex and that we need to trust the Afghan government. What about the situation on the ground as you see it?
Sure. Well, look, again, we have to support the Afghan government. They are our allies, and what they've been able to achieve so much for the society has been a direct result of the cost and blood between the coalition, certainly the United States, and our Afghan partners. So we have to trust them, we have to support them. And the United States needs to be in strategic overwatch of this entire process. We simply can't turn this over and walk away. And to Anita's point, and I was able to listen to the conversation, this agreement, from my perspective, is a failed agreement if we do not get from the Taliban an absolute commitment that they will take care of the women of Afghanistan. Not according to the Taliban standard, but according to the standard that we have established for humanitarian care of that population. The women of Afghanistan are not a marginal minority. They're half the population. The Afghan women will say they hold up half the sky. And there's no possibility of Afghanistan moving forward in a modern community of nations if the women are not equal and participants in the society going forward. I have zero, frankly, and I'm probably harsh here, I have zero confidence that the Taliban will look after the interests of women and will ultimately uphold any commitment to women's rights and the minority rights. And we should also remember what the Taliban did during the darkness to the Hazara population as well. And then finally, the Haqqanis. Andrea, you asked me about them. Let's all remember who the Haqqanis are. They have more blood on their hands from the Afghan civilians than almost any other dimension of the Taliban. And back in the 90s, they were the platform that facilitated the entry into the Soviet war of the Arabs out of the Gulf region, which would eventually take shape as Al-Qaeda and ultimately Osama bin Laden. So let's be very clear about who we're dealing with when we're dealing with the Haqqanis and the Taliban. And I've had the opportunity to sit between traditional tribal parties and civil government and try to find a power-sharing arrangement. And that's the important role that the United States has in this process. To say that we've had a successful reduction in violence, I don't know how we measured that, and then walk away from this process and leave it to, as you properly said, a weak Taliban government, or sorry, a weak Afghan government that's seeking to consolidate its capabilities, and the Taliban, who still find themselves with safe havens in Pakistan. I think that's an abdication of our strategic leadership, and we have to be involved in this process all along.
And I asked Secretary of State Pompeo that very question yesterday and did not get a response that indicated that this would be a red line and a demand by the U.S. General Allen, we have to go. We're sorry for that interruption technically, but thanks so much for your contribution. And Anita McBride, as you said, who has been stalwart on this. Thanks to both.
Look, the idea that there's going to be this revolution, Americans aren't looking for revolution. They're looking for progress. They're looking for, tell me how you're going to help me with my health care. Tell you to make me safer. Tell you how we're going to do it.
Vice President, some seem keen on a revolution.
Well, some do, but look at the numbers. We always talk about this great increase in participation. He's nowhere near, he's not going to come anywhere near generating the kind of participation of young folks that Barack did in 2008. There's no evidence of that yet. There's a lot of young people out there who are supportive of a more, I won't say rational, a more practical path to get things done.
Joe Biden, just moments ago, in a Today Show exclusive, thanks to Craig Melvin, NBC's Craig Melvin, of course, Biden making the case against Bernie Sanders in South Carolina. Just hours after Biden secured that all-important endorsement from Congressman Jim Clyburn. Joining us now, Neera Tanden, President, CEO of the Center for American Progress, and USA Today's Washington Bureau Chief Susan Page. Susan, Biden seemed to be getting his mojo back last night. It was a very wild and woolly debate in terms of anyone breaking through. Bloomberg a little better, but facing a lot of fire.
10th time's the charm, because Biden was definitely had his best debate. He seemed to have found his footing. The endorsement this morning from Congressman Clyburn, I thought, was very powerful and personal, and made the case for Biden, that he's someone that they know and that he knows us. And that is the case that that Joe Biden needs to make to win in South Carolina on Saturday, and to start gaining ground and stop the momentum that Bernie Sanders has.
But how does he do enough before Super Tuesday? Let's even posit that with this endorsement, he could come out with a double-digit lead over Sanders in South Carolina if Steyer doesn't rack up too many, siphon off too many votes. But then he has not been campaigning in Super Tuesday states. All the others have.
Yeah, I mean, the one advantage that the vice president has is he has 100% name ID. So he doesn't rely on advertising like a Pete Buttigieg or an Amy Klobuchar, who have to introduce themselves to a lot of voters. So he has that issue. I mean, I think a real challenge for him is, at this point, it does seem that Bloomberg is siphoning off votes from him rather than he's siphoning votes off from Bloomberg. And so I do think that momentum does build if he does well in South Carolina. And remember, Senator Sanders had a 1.6% victory in New Hampshire and was able to really capitalize on that as a profound victory. And so I do think the issue for the vice president is this it's compressed, but that compression may help him.
Because it's only 3 days, it may catapult him rather than having time for another.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're actually on your wave up when after a victory, but it depends on a lot how he does, and he does have to win.
We're going to have to leave it there. Neera Tan and Susan Page, great to see you both. And, of course, you can see a lot more of Craig Melvin's big interview with former Vice President Joe Biden tomorrow morning on Today. And here on MSNBC tomorrow at 11 Eastern when Craig anchors live from South Carolina, his home state.